Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Boris Johnson and Michael Gove have announced a new immigration policy which they say should be introduced if Britain leaves the European Union. They would end the automatic right of EU citizens to come to Britain. Instead, an Australian-style points-based immigration system would be brought in by the next general election. EU migrants would need to show that they could speak English and have relevant skills before coming to Britain. The Chancellor George Osborne described it as fantasy politics and branded it unworkable. Our North of England correspondent, Kieran Jenkins, has this report.
The campaign, says Nigel Farage, is getting lively. At least the ladies at the bingo in Leeds were more pleased to see him.
Never gets anywhere, does he?
Although not enough to get him in.
Right, the management want us in there, so, or the umpires don't want us in there.
Nigel Farage has had to get used to feeling somewhat sidelined. Today, the points-based immigration system he favours went mainstream. And all because Boris Johnson said it.
Is it not time we took back control of our immigration policy, gave the people of this country the pay rise that they deserve?
So who had this idea for a point system first? Was it you or Michael Gove and Boris Johnson?
I've been saying it for about a decade, but look, the fact they're now saying it is very, very good news.
Do you want a points-based immigration system?
Well, yeah, I think we should. Yeah, we do need to control it. We do need to control our immigration because it's just really it's too much, and we can't fit everybody all in.
Top stuff, thank you. Lovely. Very good.
The Aussie model he's pushing sets migrants a points target. Points for their profession, qualifications and age. So where is immigration per capita higher, here or in Australia?
In Australia, of course. They're a continent with 22 million people.
So why would we borrow a system from a country that's higher immigration?
Well, I don't think you've listened to me, have you? I said an Australian-style point system.
Did that make any sense then? We've got lower immigration than Australia already. Perhaps they should borrow our system.
An Australian-style point system, as opposed to a European Union passport that 508 million people have got.
Highly visible George Osborne disagrees.
But what a contrast today between the Leave campaign with their fantasy politics, unworkable proposals that will increase immigration, take us out of the single market and cost us jobs, and the reality check in the real world of the highly respected OECD, who points out the grim economic future for the UK outside of the EU.
I feel as though we should stay in. Very much so.
You feel you should stay in, Nigel?
Yeah, sorry, Nigel, I think we should stay in.
It seems wherever Leave campaigners go, economic questions follow.
The idea that trade would be damaged because we're not part of a political union is nonsense.
On both sides, there are arguments still to be won. Has it convinced you?
No.
Kieran Jenkins, Channel 4 News, Leeds.
Now, like it or loathe it, the city is a big chunk of the economy, so its future is a critical part of the EU referendum argument. Many of the largest banks in the square mile have not just called for Britain to stay in, but have ploughed their own money into the Remain campaign. But Leave campaigners say the city has nothing to fear from life outside the EU. Helia Ebrahimi reports.
The city, home to a global rush of capital, pumping billions of pounds through its exchanges every second. But some fear this financial mecca could see its power fade away. Its biggest threat, not regulation or bank bailouts, but an exodus caused by a vote to leave Europe.
It is highly unlikely that if we vote for Brexit, that we will not lose out in terms of financial services access across Europe, and in terms of whether we have a playing field with some of our major competitors who are regulated in Europe. Highly unlikely.
The panic caused by Brexit in the square mile has inspired tens of millions of pounds of donations from banks and hedge funds. From Goldman Sachs to Barclays, even the former RBS boss, there is a queue of voices urging Britons to stay in Europe and protect the financial services industry.
Is it difficult to get people to feel sympathy with essentially a bunch of bankers?
Well, I think that it is no part of the case that certainly I'm making as to whether bankers would be better off or less better off. I'm not even a banker myself anymore. The point I think I would make is the UK as a whole is likely to be poorer. The city is the custodian of UK Inc.'s savings, our pension funds, our life insurance policies. If the exchange rate is lower, everyone's savings and assets are less valuable, not just the cities. If there is less trade across borders, employment is lower in all sectors, not just the city. If inflation goes up, everyone's goods and services cost more to buy, not just the cities.
Yesterday, the pound had its biggest fall in 2 months, simply because an exit poll showed Brexiters and Remain voters were neck and neck. And today, the club of the world's richest nations warned that a Brexit vote would cause shockwaves, not just in the UK, but throughout the global system. There are 2 key danger points for the city. First, passporting. At the moment, banks doing business in London can automatically operate in all EU countries. Second, all sorts of transactions in euros can actually be settled here in London. If we leave, both these activities could be forced to move to the continent. But Brexiteers don't buy the idea that there's only downside risk to leaving. Staying, they claim, can be just as dangerous.
I think the European Union is exactly like the Titanic. When people looked at the Titanic, they thought because it was huge, it was safe. It sailed, and in the face of impending disaster and despite warnings, it didn't change direction and sank.
Gerard Lyons, a city veteran who became the economic brain behind Boris Johnson, says not only are there hazards to staying in Europe because of the drawbacks of the institution, but that Britain is missing opportunities only gained from seeing beyond the EU.
Finance is global. Finance increasingly knows no borders. Money and investment flows go where they find the best return. This is not a choice between Europe versus the rest of the world. This is a choice between an inward-looking, insular Europe where the economic model is not working well in the 21st century versus the opportunity to be a global UK. Now, certain businesses, because their business model, may decide to move some parts of their business elsewhere.
Isn't that catastrophic?
No.
The backbone of this argument? That the sunk costs into London's infrastructure, its talent base, and its basic attraction as a place to live mean the threats from American bankers saying they're off to Frankfurt simply doesn't ring true.
The reality is that the city and the UK does not have a veto to protect ourselves versus the Eurozone. And in recent years, both the French and the Germans have made survival of the Eurozone key and central to the European project. So therefore, there's going to be greater centralisation within the Eurozone. And no one should kid themselves that the city is not going to have to face up to further challenges within the EU in the future.
The city contributes £66 billion in taxes, employs more than 2 million people, and unlike other parts of British industry, generates a £72 billion trade surplus. While opinion is divided on the peril of Brexit in the square mile and beyond, the city is doing what it does best, finding ways of making money. And in a lovely twist of irony, hedgies and traders have found a way of making money even from the referendum, paying for privately commissioned exit polls to take early market bets on the outcome. It's hard to see these animal spirits slowing down too much.
Well, joining me now, Carolyn Fairburn, Director General of the pro-Europe business group, the CBI, and Richard Tice, a British property investor and co-founder of the Leave.eu campaign. Richard Tice, why is Carolyn Fairburn and all her members wrong?
Well, unfortunately, the track record of these people, sadly, is woeful. I mean, the CBI themselves, in the 1980s, they resisted the Thatcherite reforms. In the early 90s, they said we shouldn't leave the ERM. In the late 90s, they said we should join the euro. And now they're asking the British people to believe them again when they say it would be damaging for the UK economy. And it wouldn't be.
Carolyn Fairburn?
So I think we need to deal with the issue that we're facing now, which is the question of the membership of the European Union. And I think what we've seen incredibly clearly is how successful the city has been, actually how successful British business is being at the moment. Now, I think British bankers are very pragmatic people, and that what they're telling us very clearly, loud and clear, is that the loss of passporting rights into the European Union means they would move their businesses. They're telling me that privately. Some banks are saying this publicly. 2.2 million jobs
And these are the same banks, Goldman Sachs, Barclays, that said we should join the euro. The truth is,
you don't believe them?
No, I don't. And they've got their own vested interests, and I'm afraid they can't be trusted for the British people. These people, you know, they said it would be a disaster 17 years ago. The city now employs 50% more people than it did then.
Why would they lie?
It's in Goldman Sachs, it's in their vested interests. It's really interesting, isn't it? The corporate managers who climb the greasy corporate pole, they want to stay in. But the really successful entrepreneurs, the Peter Hargreaves of this world, people like Chris Benodi, people like Howard Shaw, you know, they are all out.
That's true, isn't it, Carolyn Fairbairn? They say we'd be free of regulation.
But let's go back to the evidence here in terms of what businesses across the board are saying. So there have been about 20 business polls since the beginning of the year. Not one has had a vote for leave. So whether you talk about farmers or Tech UK or the SMMT, many of them are over 70%.
Well, that's actually not true about farmers. 58% of farmers surveyed by the Farmers Weekly said that actually they would rather leave in spite of the NFU, one of your members, recommendation to stay in. So actually the farmers are not with you on that.
The vast majority of businesses, and I think this is proven, well, I know this is proven across the board. It's quite easy to come up with names, but I think in terms of the many businesses that we speak to, the majority are saying very clearly that they're in favour of staying. 80% of our members are saying that, and 70%...
But when it comes to the city, Carolyn Fairbairn,
yes.
Why do you believe that the financial services industry is so firmly against leaving the European Union?
Because one of the things, and it was in your introduction, the guaranteed passporting rights, it's guaranteed legally the right for British banks to be, British-based banks, London-based banks, to be able to trade freely in Europe.
But
it's hugely
well, that was already
valuable.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned that reason already. Is that it? Is that the only reason?
It is the main reason. The euro trading is another one. That has been guaranteed by the ECJ recently, the right of London to trade euros through the London market. That would not be guaranteed if we left. So the idea that many banks are saying they are drawing up contingency plans to move many of their people, talking about 2.2 million people in total in the financial services industry, to Europe is entirely credible, entirely rational.
Why did HSBC, after a 3-year review, decide to keep its global headquarters in London when it could have deferred that decision a mere 6 months, in the full knowledge that the polls were showing 50-50?
Do you have an answer to that?
The truth was because there are so much bigger issues around.
They have also said that they would move 1,000 people to European centres.
But 1,000 people is tiny. When you're talking about, you know, the overall British economy, and the only certainty about this is that if we vote Remain, Brussels will do what it's always done. It will continue to have more regulations, more centralisations, and more cost. So there is no status quo when people go to the polls. You either vote for more Brussels or you vote to leave.
Do you think the French and Germans have the City of London at heart? I mean, or would they like to weaken it as a financial service?
They absolutely regard London as a core competitor. And we know this. I mean, Frankfurt and Paris have made this extremely clear. They will be extremely interested in taking some of the business that would move out of London. I think you have to go back to what the rational interest is of pragmatic financial services companies in where they will succeed best. And you take away those passporting rights and you take that guaranteed ability to trade freely in London.
And what would be the impact on revenue for the Exchequer, do you think, if all this happened?
Well, you highlighted the tax revenues at stake, but you've also got the employment impact. And I think actually that's one of the most important things. So 2/3 of people in the financial services industry are outside London. So we're talking about potentially significant jobs across the UK.
And there is simply no evidence. 4 months ago, the Prime Minister said we would survive and thrive in the UK outside the European Union. Now he's talking about economic cataclysm. So when was he lying to the British people? Then or now?
I'm afraid we must leave it there. Thank you both very much for coming in.
5 children of a woman who was shot and paralysed by police in 1985 Scotland Yard failed to get the case dismissed on the grounds the claims held outside the time limits. The High Court judge declared the police still had a duty of care to the children 31 years after the botched armed raid on Cherry Groce's home in Brixton. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel has this exclusive report.
The final chapter is nearing its end in a long fight for justice for the children in this photo taken 31 years ago at the hospital bedside of their mother. Cherry Grosh was shot and paralysed when police raided her home looking for one of her sons suspected of armed robbery, but he wasn't even there. Lee, her other son, and his 3 sisters were in the house. He was just 11 when he witnessed police kick down the bedroom door and open fire at his mother. Time has not healed their trauma, and last week the courts acknowledged what they had all been through and ordered the police to finally compensate.
The only choice we had was, do we let it go, or do we stand up for what is true and what is right? And they deserve to be accountable for what had happened to us. What we went through was real, and we were children in that house at the time that was exposed, that witnessed a traumatic experience which then had a profound effect on our lives.
Their mother got £500,000 compensation in 1993 for spending the rest of her life in a wheelchair. It was an out-of-court settlement. The children got nothing. They had no lawyer to argue their case. The Met at the time did not admit liability, but now, 31 years on, in the High Court, the force has had to put its hands up and acknowledge they had and still have a duty of care. An inquest jury in 2014 found serious and multiple failures in that armed operation. The shooting of Cherry Grosh prompted one of the most profuse apologies a police chief has ever publicly delivered.
Today, I apologise unreservedly for our failings. I also apologise for the inexcusable fact that it's taken until now for the Met to make that public apology.
Yet 2 years on, the police's own lawyers told a High Court judge last week that the children's claim for compensation was, I quote, an unfair and contentious attempt to gain yet again from the shooting.
Throughout this whole process, all we've been asking for is to be dealt with fairly. Throughout this whole process, we've maintained our dignity and our integrity.
How do you think you've been dealt with? How do you think you've been treated?
Very unfairly. And I think that's putting it mildly.
The Metropolitan Police told Channel 4 News, "We sought to agree a settlement with family members prior to court proceedings being brought, but unfortunately this was not possible. All parties will now seek to agree a settlement of the revised claim." 3 years ago, the family couldn't even get legal aid. Now the police will have to pay another price for their mistaken shooting of an innocent mother.
Simon Israel reporting.